Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm going to be testing a GeForce RTX 4090 in Alan Wake 2. A very intensive title. This one is the Asus ROG Strix version of the card. I am running it with the latest Nvidia drivers and I'm not manually overclocking it. You can see all of its specs right here in Tech Power-Up's GPU 0, sizeable bar is also enabled. And over on the left, I'm pairing it with a Ryzen 9 7950X 3D CPU with half of its cores disabled, making it the same as a 7800X 3D and 32 gigabytes of RAM. Let's get into it, shall we? Alright, let's go over the settings first. I am starting at 4K resolution with DLEA, and I'm also going to test some DLSS later on, as well as lower and higher resolutions. Oh yeah. And scrolling down here to the effects, you can see that everything is disabled here because it's just motion blur, film grain, and lens distortion. If you like these effects, feel free to enable them. They shouldn't really impact your FPS. And down here, I have it set to custom settings because I maxed everything out over on the quality settings. So basically these are maxed out settings without ray tracing, okay, because ray tracing is all turned off at the moment, but I will also try that out in this video. And here we are, guys, we're getting 50 something frames per second. This is in this forest area, which is extremely demanding. If you go to the city area, it will end up getting higher FPS, okay. This is also the beginning of the game, but this is where you're gonna see the least frames per second, basically. And even the RTX 4090 drops from 60 frames per second. This is really demanding, as you can see. Thankfully, DLSS in this title looks very good, okay? So you can actually enable it on quality with very minimal or basically no visual loss in this game. Even FSR2 looks really good. And the good thing is, the game is not stuttering, but as soon as I tried to say that, we got a little spike in the frame time graph. Of course, because it always happens, right? Also, that power utilization is very high. Look at that, going over 440 watts at times. That's normal, of course. The 4090 is rated at 450 watts TDP, but you don't usually see it's reaching 450 watts. Actually, it's very rare to see it go over the 420 watt mark, you know. This means that the game is actually fully utilizing the power of the 4090. All of those CUDA cores and stuff are being properly utilized, you know, and still it is very intensive, as you can see. So you can get nearly 60 frames per second on average here in this very intensive area, as I told you. In the city area, again, you're going to see higher FPS, so I'm going to keep using this area for the benchmark testing. But yeah, it is getting 58 FPS average, 1% lows at 50. If you play with a controller, for example, on a big 4K TV, it's going to look fantastic, it's going to feel fantastic, but on a mouse and keyboard, it's not 60 plus FPS, you know, so you might want to change things down a little, and that's where DLSS Quality comes in. So we have it set to DLSS right here on quality. That means that the game is rendering at 1440p resolution and upscaling to 4K, our native resolution now, still utilizing the highest settings possible. And I mean, I'm standing still right now. I was standing still for a bit as well at native resolution. Can you tell the difference? I doubt it, it's YouTube, so the compression is gonna wreck everything, but I can tell you guys, I cannot tell a difference between quality DLSS in this title and native resolution. Maybe those little branches are a little bit fuzzier, but that's about it. It has very minimal visual impacts here at these settings, and it looks insane still. And it also lowers the power utilization by a little bit, as you can see. So this is my preferred way to play Alan Wake 2, actually, on the RTX 4090. No need to utilize frame generation, but if you want that higher refresh rate experience, feel free to enable that. I will also do that in a little bit, of course. And I'm saying I can't really tell a difference while having it running on a 42-inch monitor, all right? So, if I can tell a difference here on a smaller monitor, it will be even harder to tell a difference. Obviously, a 4090 is a very expensive GPU. It should be getting, I guess, more than 60 FPS all of the time at native res, but this game is extremely intensive. Once again, it has some really high-end technologies going on when you max out the settings, so it's super demanding. Overall, it is a smooth experience. It feels great on high refresh rate panel, even with 80 FPS or so. It's noticeable, the difference between 60 and 80, and it works. It works very well. Now let's go ahead and try 4K with frame generation and DLAA. This is FG over native resolution, all right? So the input lag is going to be a bit more noticeable, yes, compared to DLSS quality. The quality of the visuals are basically the same once again as the quality DLSS at 4K resolution. But yeah, guys, since it looks pretty much the same as before and it has that added input lag, I wouldn't really utilize this, alright? It may be getting a little bit higher FPS than quality DLSS, but it doesn't really matter. The input lag is about the same as the native resolution, or actually it's a little bit worse than the native resolution with 50-something FPS. It's like you are playing with 40-ish frames per second, or half the frame rate basically of what we're seeing on screen at the moment. And while with the controller that doesn't matter at all, with mouse and keyboard, you can tell the difference in the input lag, and it feels a little bit worse, okay? In terms of VRAM utilization, it's utilizing 11 gigabytes and allocating 12.5, so a 12 gigabyte GPU with these settings would already be struggling a little bit, but of course we got 24 gigabytes here, so no problems at all, right? Anyway, let's keep that frame generation enabled now and use it over quality DLSS, and these are the settings if you want a high refresh rate experience, I guess, in this particular title. Like, it applies FG over quality DLSS, which is upscaled from 1440p to 4K resolution here, and it gets you around 110 to 120 frames per second. Remember that outside of here, when you get to the city area, it's going to become a little bit less intensive, so you can actually reach 120 or 130 FPS at times, and that will feel buttery smooth, of course. Even this feels really, really nice and smooth. Yeah, it still has a couple of frame time spikes over there, but they are smaller than what we're used to at this point with Unreal Engine 5, you know? So yeah, this is going to be a pretty smooth experience like this. The input lag is very minimal because you're above 100 frames per second, so for a single player title, it doesn't matter at all with this amount of input lag. Feels good, looks very good still. Again, it might be slightly softer than quality DLSS was, but quality DLSS was very similar to native resolution here in this game, so it still looks like native resolution. All right, I'm gonna try some performance DLSS right now without frame generation. This renders the game at 1080p resolution and upscales it to 4K. It still looks incredible, guys. Like, I can't tell the difference now compared to quality DLSS or native resolution. There is a little bit of fuzziness around the hair of our character right now. Also a little bit of ghosting that I'm seeing here, but it still looks very, very good. I think if you're using like a 27-inch or a 32-inch monitor at 4K, maybe not the 32-inch, but the 27-inch monitor or 28-inch monitor at 4K, I would utilize Performance DLSS. It gives you a little bit extra smoothness at native frames, you know, not using frame generation, and it still looks incredible to me, guys. And with frame generation over it, let's enable that, it gets 130 plus, basically, reaching 140 at times. So this is a proper higher refresh rate experience, you know, if you want to get close to maxing out and actually max out a 144 Hz monitor in the city areas and later parts of the game, you know. This is it. These are the settings for you probably. It's gonna look great. It's gonna perform awesome in terms of the... What is going on with the mouse? Oh my gosh, it feels like I'm losing signal right here. What the heck? Sometimes my mouse is acting up, you know, in these videos. I don't know, I probably need a new mouse. But anyways, yeah, I should probably buy it right now because it's Cyber Monday, I think. Leave your recommendations for a mouse down below. It needs to be wireless, okay? Anyway, moving on. It is buttery smooth, basically. No problems whatsoever right here. Obviously, to be expected. But let's disable everything and let's set the actual resolution to 1440p. And at 2560 by 1440p native with no frame generation, highest settings aside from ray tracing, okay, it gets pretty much around the same FPS as Quality DLSS, right? I think so. Quality DLSS at 4K resolution was getting us 80 to 90 FPS, I believe. Maybe some drops into the 70s as well, but this one is also getting 80 to 90s. It might not drop into the 70s anymore, but it is a pretty solid experience, right, guys? I mean, when you think about an RTX 4090 at 1440p resolution, you think of super high refresh rates, maybe 240 hertz experiences and so on, but in this game, that's not gonna happen, okay? Unless you utilize DLSS plus frame generation, of course. Even then, it won't really reach 240 frames per second, but in other titles, it definitely can, okay? But here, yeah, you don't really need that super high refresh rate either. It's going to be pretty stable, of course, and that's to be expected. I don't want to compromise with a 4090, even at 4K, let alone at 1440p, right? But what if we utilize like frame generation over native resolution? This will give us a pretty high refresh rate experience. Yep, there we go. Kind of the same, actually a little bit higher than what we saw at the 4K resolution with Performance DLSS. And this is still 1440p native, just with that frame generation over the native resolution. And it looks great. Input lag-wise, you can still feel the difference, you know, between native FPS and FPS with frame generation, even at 140 frames per second, but it's really negligible. It doesn't really matter at these frame rates in a single-player title, okay? If it was a multiplayer shooter, for example, you need super fast reactions, you need to do quick scopes. Actually, maybe not, that's a Call of Duty thing, but you need to flick shot and stuff like that, and it's a lot harder to do with frame generation enabled, even at 200 plus frames per second. So that's why I never enable frame generation in multiplayer shooters, and I don't understand the implementation of it in multiplayer shooters. Some people play like that, it's fine, but for a competitive person, no. Okay. Anyway, you won't need to be competitive in the Alan Wake, so it's fine. All right, 144 FPS average is what we get here. And what about Quality DLSS? This renders the game at 960p and then upscales to 1440p. Still looks incredible, guys. I mean, this is a 42-inch monitor, all right, that I'm using here. It's 4K resolution, so we're not running native resolution right now. But it still looks extremely similar to the native 1440p resolution experience that I just saw previously. It's a little bit softer than it would be on a 1440p display, obviously. A lot softer than like a 27-inch 1440p display. But the difference between this and the native resolution, at least here in my monitor, is negligible still. This game is a game that you should probably play with some DLSS if you don't have the raw power to run native resolution. But even if you do, like, why not? It looks the same, right? Anyway, should we go down there, actually? Yeah, I didn't really go down there yet in this video, so let's do this. Also, I miss Bob in this game. I think it was with the RTX 4080 that I found Bob in this title, and I have never seen him ever since, which is quite a bit of a shame, you know. Anyway, let's stop it there, guys, and let's go to DLSS frame generation over Quality DLSS at 1440p. Can we get 200? Oh, it gets very close. I guess looking in some directions, it might actually get up to 200 frames per second, guys. Look at that. 199, come on, hit 200, game, please. Oh, I will need to look at the sky to hit 200 frames per second, I guess. Or if you just go to the city area again, you're gonna hit 200 FPS like this. Now, is this needed? No. Is this absolutely ridiculous and you can flex to your friends that you're getting close to 200 frames per second in Alan Wake 2, one of the most intensive titles? Yes. It's a flex thing, I guess, at this point, because if you have a 1440p monitor, I just set it to 1440p native and forget it. Maybe DLSS Quality as well, because, again, it looks very similar to native resolution. It gives you a bit of a boost in FPS, but that's about it. No need to enable FG over all of that. But let's go down to 1080p resolution with DLAA. I'm going to turn off frame generation now, still using the max settings without ray tracing, and it's not as high as you'd expect, I guess, right? It is not a super high refresh rate experience even at 1080p resolution. It just goes to show you how intensive this game really is. It's extremely demanding, basically, especially here in the woods area once again. But hey, if you have a 1080p monitor actually with a 4090, this is what you can expect. Maybe upgrades. 1440p is a huge difference in terms of visual fidelity. It's so much sharper at the same or even at a higher display size, a bigger display size. Like a 24-inch 1080p is pretty normal, you know, PPI is about 93, 91, something like that. And the 1440p display at 27 inches has 106 PPI or 107 PPI. It is much sharper in a bigger size as well. I really recommend you to grab a 1440p monitor, even a 1440p ultra wide, which I don't really test in these videos because they are already too long, you know, and not a lot of people use ultra wides. Maybe I should make like a separate ultra wide video, but that's for another day, okay? Yeah, but that's really adequate for a 4090 these days. You can play even the UE5 super intensive titles with software ray tracing enabled and so on. There's no need to go down to 1080p resolution with an RTX 4090. Enabling frame generation over native 1080p resolution gives us 190 frames per second. Damn, that's crazy. Almost 200 frames per second. All right, I'm not gonna walk around a lot here at the 1080p resolution. I keep saying it's 1440p. It's 1080p. Quality DLSS upscales the game from 720p resolution here at 1080p res. It still looks incredible for what it is, guys. Like, it is soft, of course. It's going to be softer than native resolution, but it's still extremely close to native resolution at 1080p, even though this is freaking 720p, you know? Still looks great. The hair still looks good, although super soft because this is a 42-inch monitor as well. Yeah, 130s, 140s. I wouldn't really do this, obviously. But this is just for fun, guys. Let's enable frame generation on top of quality DLSS, on top of 1080p resolution. And this is finally getting 200 plus frames per second. If you're going for that competitive Alan Wake 2 experience, I guess don't use this because it's better without frame generation since it adds input lag and for competitive people it matters. But I guess if you want to flex the most on your friends, you can use this and tell them you're getting 200 plus FPS in Alan Wake 2. It's gonna be crazy, right? Anyway, we should go up to 8K resolution next. This is the GPU destroyer here, finally, the resolution. Using the ultra settings, oh my goodness, okay. Yep, I think it actually ran out of VRAM, guys. Because the RAM usage is extremely high. I don't think it was at 24 gigabytes previously. So it swapped a lot of things that should have been on the VRAM into the RAM already, and that's why it is performing so poorly with 15 FPS. I guess it also makes sense because this is 4 times 4K resolution. Crazy stuff, okay? It's like using 4 4K monitors at the same time. And given that we saw 50 to 60 FPS at 4K native, I guess 15 is kind of expected at 8K. Alright, so no maximum settings for you if you're playing at 8K resolution, but maybe if you play with Performance DLSS, which is 2160p internally, this is 4K upscaled to 8K resolution, crazy stuff still, very crazy numbers, you can get 30 plus, look at that. Obviously, the upscaling part is still very taxing on the GPU. The RAM usage keeps going up like crazy to 30 gigabytes, then down to 11. I've never seen that before, actually. That's really weird, but most of the time it is at 30 gigabytes of RAM usage. I think we need to restart the game, guys. Okay, after the restart, the VRAM and the RAM are completely fine. Let's hit continue there. All right, that's better, guys. FPS are actually exactly the same as before, but now the RAM usage isn't at 30 gigabytes anymore. It's at 9, how it should be. Okay. Anyway, 40 FPS, sometimes 30 to 40 is what you should see here. It's still going to be a playable experience, but come on, like, it's 8K resolution. Maybe the 5090 can provide a very awesome experience with these settings with Performance DLSS, but a 4090 certainly can't in a super intensive title like Alan Wake 2, so forget about it, okay? With DLSS frame generation, I'm wondering if it will run out of VRAM, because this consumes a lot of VRAM as well, especially at higher resolutions. Look at that, 20 gigabytes of VRAM allocation, almost. And it barely improved our FPS. It gave us like, what, 10, 12 FPS higher than previously. Input lag-wise, though, it is very noticeable. I would not do this at all to achieve 10 more FPS. If you must play at 8K resolution because you're running on like an 8K TV, for example, with DLSS, I would just use DLSS Performance, no frame generation, and that's gonna be your best experience. Now, disabling FG and trying like ultra performance DLSS, let's see, this renders the game at 1440p and upscales to 8K. Extremely big difference in terms of resolutions. But yeah, since the upscalers work extremely well in this title, I think this is not a bad experience still, guys. It still looks great, even at 8K Ultra Performance DLSS. In other titles, in most games actually, Ultra Performance at 8K does make quite a bit of a difference to the visuals, but here, not so much. You can still see like the zipper on our jacket over there, and even if I move around like this, there is a little bit of weirdness going on, a little bit of noise that I can notice, but it's super minimal. Like, yeah, that's pretty good. The hair is also a little bit fuzzy, though, with Ultra Performance DLSS here. But aside from that minimal difference in visuals, it still looks awesome. Now, enabling frame generation over this might actually put us at 60 frames per second. Very close to it, 59. Again, the input lag is massive here because it's below 60 FPS as a baseline without the frame generation, so it feels really bad with frame generation enabled. You shouldn't really do this. Again, at 8K resolution, the GPU just isn't fast enough to be able to utilize frame generation properly at 8K resolution. It's the same as using frame generation at 4K with an RTX 4060, although that runs out of VRAM, you know, but usually you don't see a big difference in FPS at 4K resolution with frame generation on and off with a 4060. It's like a 5 FPS difference, and here it's exactly the same thing with a 4090 but at 8K resolution. And now, guys, I just restarted the game. We're back to 4K resolution using DLAA and no frame generation, highest settings over here, and high ray tracing as well. The ray tracing settings are all maxed out as well, basically, okay? So ray reconstruction is enabled, direct lighting as well, path tracing is set to high, path traced in direct lighting is also set to high over there. It is crazy. I think the 4090 is gonna get wrecked at 4K with these settings. Let's see. Oh boy, yep, it is a cinematic experience, my friends, with native resolution at 4K with path tracing. It's absolutely crazy. Now, the fact that we're getting 20-something FPS and actually high 20s at times over here in the forest area means that in the city area, it's actually going to be at 30 FPS, all right? Pretty insane. But of course, yeah, this isn't really playable. When you come here, and you will need to come here even after you go to the forest, to the city area again, you're gonna get back here after a couple of missions, and this is what you'll see, 20-something FPS. It's not great, but what is absolutely amazing about the path tracing in this game is that lighting and the shadows are completely fixed. We don't see any shadow popping at all at the moment. The lighting looks gorgeous with path tracing. It also looked gorgeous without ray tracing or path tracing at all, but with this enabled, it's just on another level, basically, and there's absolutely zero popping of shadows or lighting at all. Like, this is absolutely beautiful. This game's visuals are fantastic. Textures could be a little bit higher. For example, in Stalker 2, the textures are definitely higher quality than this. So there are some things that some UE5 titles do better than this game, but in terms of the overall look of it, it's a great looking game, right? Obviously, if you're playing with path tracing, you'll need DLSS because you can't run path tracing natively. I think even at 1080p it won't get 60 FPS. We'll get there, of course. But here with quality DLSS, things improve like crazy. From 27 FPS to 47 FPS. This is a lot better of an experience. It's now playable. I would still not recommend it because it's still 40 frames per second, right? So it's not amazing. You're spending a lot of money on a GPU to play at 40 FPS. Just doesn't feel right, okay? But yeah, if you want path tracing at close or basically native resolution looks, but it is with quality DLSS, it's going to be playable this time around. That's the power of the 4090. Look at the power usage as well. I think maybe with native resolution it went up to 450 watts, probably, right? Because DLSS usually lowers the power utilization quite a bit. Now, enabling frame generation over quality DLSS might be a decent idea if you play with a controller, because with mouse and keyboard you can feel that input lag, of course. But hey, I guess maybe if you're playing on your 4K TV in the living room, big 4K OLED, high refresh rate, it looks awesome actually. And enable frame generation, path tracing, maximum settings in Alan Wake 2, absolute complete maxed out, you know, aside from the resolution scaling or upscaling actually. And playing with the controller, it will feel pretty good, all right? Even though it has quite a big amount of input lag right now, and I wouldn't recommend the mouse and keyboard like this, with the controller, it's going to be fine. I have tested it time and time again, and the frame generation input lag playing with a controller is basically not noticeable above like 70 frames per second. This still might drop into like the 60s. It might become a little bit noticeable even on a controller then, but it's not really a big deal, guys. Anyway, let's disable frame gen and use performance DLSS because this is what Nvidia actually recommends at 4K resolution for the quality of DLSS. And now we're upscaling from 1080p resolution all the way up to 4K, and it's actually getting 60-ish frames per second on average, but we saw it already dropped into the 50s briefly. So it's not going to be 60 plus all of the time, unfortunately. For that, you'll still need frame generation. But the good thing is, with frame generation now over the performance DLSS and over 60 FPS natively, it's going to feel good. You can also try and overclock the RTX 4090 and push it to 600 watts if you really want to. Yeah, it's you can, right? I would not do it because the power consumption, it would be insane and your room would get really, really hot. But if you want to get a few extra frames, that's an option, and you will be likely getting like 66, 67, maybe 68 FPS average then. But let's enable that frame generation on top of performance DLSS at 4K now, and now with path tracing enabled, we can get a smooth 90 to 100 frames per second apparently. It might drop into the 80s. Input lag wise, still noticeable, okay? I mean, it's even noticeable at 150 FPS as I told you. But if you don't mind that little extra input lag, it's going to feel smooth, it's going to look fantastic, and it's just an awesome experience overall. I'm not sure if I would do this or just 4K with quality DLSS with no ray tracing or path tracing whatsoever, because that still felt really responsive, it still looked really good, but it had that shadow pop-in, which I really didn't like, okay? It can get really distracting, and here you don't have that shadow pop-in, and things just look a little bit better overall as well in terms of the lighting and the shadow quality. Either way, it's going to be a decent experience, I think, in a single-player title. 100 FPS with frame generation is all right. You know, it's not amazing, but it's definitely passable in my opinion in terms of input lag. And again, if you are playing with a controller, it's going to feel even better. You won't really feel the input lag at 100 frames per second average, I think. So it's going to be great, guys. This is insane, actually. This is what Nvidia likes to showcase in those little clips that they put on YouTube and Instagram and so on, and social media basically, showing RTX on with path tracing, frame generation and so on, going from 25 FPS all the way up to 100 FPS. They do that a lot with Cyberpunk, for example. Yeah, this is what they do basically. Frame generation over performance DLSS with all of the bells and whistles enabled, can give you a playable experience, even though we were at 25 FPS or so at native resolution. All of these technologies do make quite a big difference, and they just should be implemented right. You know, they are performance enhancers, and they shouldn't be relied on by the developers, and that's what we see a lot of developers doing these days, even putting frame generation in the system requirements, which I feel is absolutely ridiculous. Next is 1440p native resolution with maxed out settings including path tracing, and finally we can achieve playable FPS at a native resolution. Although, yeah, it's not 60 plus FPS, so it's not amazing. But it just goes to show you once again how intensive path tracing really is. The best GPU out there, which can play like Cyberpunk, for example, at 1440p ray tracing, I think, even with 60 FPS, probably, native resolution. In this one, with the path tracing enabled, it can't do it, okay? It's in the 40s, 50s, a couple of bigger stutters happening right now, not sure why. At 4K we didn't see those, so they're probably just one-offs, I guess. But yeah, this is so damn intensive that even 1440p native resolution doesn't get to 60 FPS. Now, enabling frame generation over native res here puts us in the 90s. Very similar experience to what we saw at 4K resolution with Performance DLSS and FG. In terms of input lag, it's pretty much the same thing. It's 90 FPS after all, 90 to 100 on average, I guess. Yeah, dropping down into the 80s sometimes. You could do this, but again, the visuals look so good with quality DLSS that I think I would just use quality DLSS instead of frame generation to get a higher frame rate without the added input lag. And this is it. We're getting 70s, a little bit lower than with frame generation enabled over native, but this is native FPS that we're seeing here with no added input lag. It feels more responsive and so on. It still feels smooth, of course. It's above 60 frames per second, and it shouldn't drop from 60 FPS at all, I think. 68 there, so maybe in the other little corridor through the woods it might drop. I don't know. I really hope it doesn't. But yeah, this is a solid experience, and if you want all the bells and whistles enabled at 1440p, I would either do this or the frame generation. But I think I'm leaning towards this a little bit more because of that visual fidelity that you get from quality DLSS. It's so good in this game. Anyway, yeah, this is not really dropping from 60 FPS. This is solid experience overall here. Now, with frame generation over quality DLSS is where things start shining a lot for the RTX 4090. Kind of impressive again, you know, 100 plus frames per second. Input lag is minimal. Visuals are awesome still. A little bit softer than they were with quality DLSS alone, but it's not a big deal. Yeah, I can't see the zipper teeth anymore at these settings though, so keep that in mind. You're gonna lose a little bit of detail, of course. It's obvious we're running a native resolution that's lower than previously. But yeah, we do get 120 FPS, 120 plus on average all of the time. And outside of here, again, it's going to be like 140, probably 145, something like that. It's a little bit less intensive, once again, in the city area. It's starting to become pretty good. I wish we could get these FPS at 4K, but hey, we're not there yet. Maybe with the RTX 5090, we will be able to see 4K quality DLSS frame generation with 130 FPS in this game with all of these settings enabled at the same time. I really hope we do. And finally, we're at 1080p with DLAA, no frame generation, highest settings possible. Can we get 60 plus? Yes, we can. I thought we wouldn't be able to, actually, after seeing 25 FPS at 4K. But apparently, we can get 70s on average at 1080p with path tracing, native resolution. But I mean, again, it's 1080p res. 1440p with quality DLSS looks better than 1080p native resolution. Okay, on a native 1440p panel compared to a native 1080p panel, it will look better at 1440p with quality DLSS. I highly recommend you to upgrade your monitor if you're running 1080p on a 4090. So that means that we can enable DLSS frame generation over native resolution here and achieve 120 frames per second, minimal input lag, once again, high refresh rate, feels good, it looks good, looks very similar again to native resolution. Obviously the teeth on the The zippers of our jacket are completely gone at this point at 1080p res, but yeah, it will look very good, of course, on a native 1080p display with the frame generation enabled. Now, if you use DLSS quality on top of that, obviously things jump up like crazy into the 150s, 160s, but I think this starts looking a bit too bad, in my opinion, because it's 720p internally. Once again, even on a 1080p monitor, DLSS quality doesn't look the greatest. But again, at 1440p with quality DLSS, it looks nice in most games. And at 4K with quality DLSS, it looks basically the same as 4K in most games. There are lots of games where you can't tell the difference, you know, but in most of them, it usually looks really good with quality DLSS at 4K and the quality DLSS at 1440p as well. With all of that said, guys, that's been it. I think I'm not going to test 8K with path tracing. Or should we? And if you're wondering, that's the size of the on-screen display at 8K resolution compared to 1080p resolution. The 1080p was like this size. It's so small. That's what she said. And you know what? Let's disable frame generation because that's not a good idea at 8K. Let's still use ultra performance DLSS and let's see how it does. 30s. That's a bit surprising, actually. Not too bad. 33. All right. Obviously, it will still drop into the 20s probably in extremely intensive scenarios, but it's getting 30s. I didn't see I would see 30s with path tracing at 8K. Well, 8K. This is upscaled from 1440p. But yeah, it still says 8K on the actual resolution. So there's that. And it will look amazing, super, super detailed on an 8K TV, for example, or 8K monitor. But anyway, that's been it for this one. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you in the next one very soon. As always, love you all. Bye-bye.